The marble floors of the Emerald Grand Hotel gleamed under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But Maya Chen wasn't looking at the opulence anymore. She was staring at the man on his knees, scrubbing those floors, while three managers stood over him laughing, their expensive shoes inches from his calloused hands. And something inside her chest cracked open like a fault line, because this was the third time this week she'd watched Ethan Corleone endure their cruelty without a single word of defense. His dark eyes calm as still water, even as they called him worthless, even as they joked about how pathetic it must be to clean up after people who would never know his name. Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Stella's Love Tales, where power meets passion and love always finds a way, even in the most unexpected places. I'm so glad you're here with me today, and I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Are you cozy at home, or maybe sneaking this story in during your lunch break? And hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button right now because you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out in this story. Trust me, this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Maya had worked at the Emerald Grand for 3 years as a receptionist, her smile professionally trained to welcome guests who spent more on a single night's stay than she earned in a month. And she'd learned to make herself invisible to the managers and senior staff who treated people like her as part of the furniture, useful but unremarkable. But 6 months ago, something shifted when she noticed Ethan during her break, really noticed him for the first time. Not just as the quiet janitor who cleaned the lobby floors at dawn, but as a man whose hands moved with unexpected grace as he worked, whose eyes held an intelligence that seemed completely at odds with the way everyone dismissed him, as if he were nothing. The other staff mocked her almost immediately when they realized she'd started bringing him coffee during his shifts. The whispers started in the break room like poison spreading through water. Maya's desperate, they said. She can't do better than the janitor. They laughed. And even her closest friend Sophia had pulled her aside with genuine concern in her voice, saying, "He cleans toilets." Maya, he can't take care of you. You're throwing your life away on someone who will never be able to give you anything. But what none of them understood, what they couldn't see, because they'd never bothered to look past his worn uniform and cleaning cart, was that Ethan listened to her in a way no one else ever had. He remembered the small things she mentioned in passing. He noticed when she was tired or sad, and there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that didn't match his circumstances, as if he were playing a role in a play, only he understood. The mockery escalated when Maya and Ethan started having lunch together in the service courtyard behind the hotel, away from the judgmental stares. The managers began making pointed comments when they saw her. "Careful, Maya! You might catch poverty," one of them said loud enough for the entire front desk to hear, and the head of housekeeping, a woman named Patricia, who wore her authority like armor, had actually pulled Maya into her office to warn her that associating with low-level staff reflects poorly on your professional image, as if loving someone required a resume and salary verification, as if the content of Ethan's character could be measured by the mop in his hands. But Maya had made her choice. She'd looked into Ethan's eyes one evening, after a particularly brutal day when a guest had berated him for 20 minutes over a spot on the carpet that wasn't even there. And she'd seen something that made her heart recognize a truth her mind couldn't explain. This man was not what he appeared to be. There were depths to him that the fluorescent lights and industrial cleaning supplies couldn't diminish. And when he'd asked her quietly if she wanted to get dinner sometime, somewhere far from the hotel and its cruelty, she'd said yes without hesitation. They'd married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. No fancy reception, no guest list filled with people who would judge them. Just Maya, in a cream dress she'd found on sale, and Ethan in the only suit he owned. And when he'd slipped the simple gold band on her finger, she'd felt more certain of this choice than anything else in her life. Even as she knew returning to work on Monday would mean facing a tsunami of mockery and whispered pity from people who would never understand that sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it comes with calloused hands and quiet strength instead of corner offices and expensive cars. And sometimes the man everyone else overlooks is exactly the one who sees you most clearly. But as Maya stood now in the employee break room 3 months after their wedding, listening to two senior managers discuss how that poor receptionist married the janitor, and now she's stuck with him, watching through the doorway as Ethan methodically cleaned the same section of floor he'd cleaned 1,000 times before, she found herself wondering about the mystery she'd sensed in him from the beginning. Wondering why a man with such intelligence and presence would accept this treatment day after day without complaint. Wondering what secrets lived behind those calm, dark eyes that never showed anger even when they should. And most of all, wondering if she'd married a man whose depths she'd only begun to discover, or if love had simply made her see things that weren't really there. Maya Chen had learned to read people during her 3 years behind the Emerald Grand's reception desk. She could spot a difficult guest within seconds of their arrival, could predict which couples were celebrating anniversaries, and which were barely holding their marriages together, could sense when someone was lying about a reservation or genuinely confused. But Ethan Corleone remained the only person she'd ever met who she couldn't fully decipher. And that mystery had become as addictive as the way he looked at her when he thought no one else was watching, as if she were the only real thing in a hotel full of expensive illusions. Her mother had called from Chicago 3 times since the wedding, each conversation a variation of the same theme. Maya, you're 28 years old. You could have married that accountant from church. You could have waited for someone with a future. Why would you throw yourself away on a man who cleans floors? And Maya had stopped trying to explain that Ethan made her feel seen in a way no accountant ever had. That his quiet presence steadied something restless inside her that she hadn't even known needed steadying. That when he touched her hand, the rest of the world's noise simply fell away. Ethan himself remained an enigma, wrapped in a janitor's uniform. He never complained about the work, never showed anger when guests treated him like furniture, or when managers barked orders at him as if he were a dog. He simply nodded and completed whatever task was demanded, with a precision that seemed almost meditative. But Maya had noticed things that didn't quite fit the picture everyone else accepted without question, like the way he read philosophy books during his breaks. Dense texts by Nietzsche and Sartre that he'd pull from his locker with the same casual ease. Other staff pulled out their phones, or the way he sometimes spoke with an eloquence that seemed at odds with his circumstances, his vocabulary rich and precise when they were alone together, as if he were code switching between two different versions of himself. The other staff at the Emerald Grand had formed their own ecosystem of relationships and hierarchies. Patricia Monroe, the head of housekeeping, ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in fake smiles. She'd worked at the hotel for 15 years and treated her position like a military rank. She was the one who'd warned Maya most explicitly about the janitor situation, as she called it, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like condescension. I've seen girls like you before, Maya. Kind hearts that get taken advantage of. Men like him see a pretty face and a steady paycheck, and they latch on like parasites. You deserve better than being a janitor's wife. Then there was David Deckard, the hotel's general manager, a man in his 50s who wore expensive suits and treated the staff like chess pieces in a game only he understood. He'd been particularly cruel to Ethan over the past few months, assigning him the worst tasks, making him clean the same areas multiple times, once even forcing him to scrub the parking garage floors on his hands and knees while important guests walked past. And Maya had watched Ethan endure it all without a word of protest, his face calm as a mask, and she'd wanted to scream at him to fight back, to defend himself, to show some spark of anger. But he'd simply squeezed her hand later and said, "Some battles aren't worth fighting yet." Maya's best friend Sophia worked in the hotel's restaurant. They'd started on the same day 3 years ago and had bonded over shared frustration with demanding guests and impossible managers. But the friendship had strained since Maya's relationship with Ethan began. Sophia couldn't understand it. Couldn't see past the uniform and the mop bucket. "He's nice, Maya. I get that, but nice doesn't pay rent. Nice doesn't build a future. What happens when you want kids? When you need a real home? Is he going to support you by cleaning toilets forever?" And Maya had stopped trying to explain that Ethan had depth. Sophia refused to acknowledge that there was something in him that suggested this janitor role was temporary, even though she couldn't explain why she felt that so strongly. The hotel itself had become a character in their story. The Emerald Grand, with its 300 rooms spread across 40 floors. Its restaurants that served meals costing more than Maya's weekly salary. Its spa where wealthy women paid thousands for treatments. Its ballrooms that hosted weddings with guest lists pulled from Forbes magazines. And somewhere in the building's corporate offices that staff were never allowed to enter, there was an owner, a mysterious billionaire who'd bought the property 5 years ago and had never once appeared in person. The staff whispered about him sometimes, speculated about why someone would own a $300 million hotel empire and never show their face. David Deckard claimed to have phone meetings with him, but no one had ever seen proof. And the owner remained as invisible as air, present in every policy and decision, but never materializing into flesh and blood. What Maya didn't tell anyone, what she kept locked in her heart like a secret too fragile to speak aloud, was that she'd started having dreams about Ethan. Not romantic dreams, but strange visions where he stood in expensive suits in boardrooms, where he commanded rooms full of people with the same quiet authority he used to push his cleaning cart, where the calm intelligence in his eyes finally matched his circumstances. And she'd wake up confused, wondering if love had made her delusional, or if some part of her soul recognized something her conscious mind couldn't yet accept. And on those mornings when she'd arrive at work and see him on his knees scrubbing floors while managers mocked him, she'd feel a strange certainty building in her chest, a conviction that the man she'd married was playing a role in a story whose final act hadn't been written yet. And when that act finally came, when whatever truth he was hiding finally emerged, the entire world of the Emerald Grand Hotel would shatter like the crystal chandeliers that hung above them. Beautiful and fragile, and completely unprepared for the impact. The emergency staff meeting was called at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, which was unusual enough to send ripples of anxiety through the Emerald Grand's employees. But what made Maya's stomach drop was the way David Deckard stood at the front of the conference room with sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the air conditioning, his expensive suit suddenly looking like costume jewelry under the fluorescent lights. And when he cleared his throat 3 times before speaking, everyone knew something massive was about to detonate in their carefully ordered world. "The owner is coming today," David announced, his voice cracking slightly on the word owner. "He's conducting an unannounced inspection of the entire property. He'll be arriving at noon. And I need everyone to understand that your jobs depend on this going perfectly. He's never visited in person before. Never. And if he's coming now, it means he's evaluating whether to keep this location or sell it. So I need every surface spotless, every guest interaction flawless, every single detail perfect. Do you understand me? Perfect." The room erupted in panicked whispers, staff members exchanging terrified glances, because the invisible billionaire who owned their $300 million empire was finally materializing, finally stepping out of the shadows of corporate mystery. And Patricia Monroe immediately started barking orders about deep cleaning every room, every hallway, every corner, her voice shrill with the kind of fear that comes from realizing your authority might be meaningless in the face of real power. Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the chaos unfold, watched managers who usually strutted through the hotel like peacocks suddenly scrambling like frightened children, and she found herself searching the room for Ethan, needing to see his calm presence, needing that steadiness he always provided, but he wasn't there. Janitors hadn't been invited to the emergency meeting because in David's world they didn't matter enough to warrant the information. She found him 20 minutes later in the service hallway, methodically organizing his cleaning supplies. And when she told him about the owner's impending arrival, he simply nodded, his dark eyes unreadable, and said, "I know," which should have been impossible, because how could a janitor know about an emergency meeting he wasn't invited to? But before Maya could ask, he'd touched her cheek gently and said, "Everything's going to change today, Maya, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Can you trust me even when nothing makes sense?" The hotel transformed into a frenzy of preparation, staff running in every direction, florists arriving with thousands of dollars worth of arrangements, the kitchen preparing elaborate dishes in case the owner wanted to sample the restaurant, valets practicing their greeting routines. And through it all, Maya felt a strange electricity in the air, as if the building itself knew something momentous was approaching, as if the marble floors and crystal chandeliers were holding their breath. At 11:45, David gathered the senior staff in the lobby, positioning them in a receiving line like soldiers awaiting inspection. Patricia stood there smoothing her uniform obsessively. The restaurant manager kept checking his watch. The head of security adjusted his tie 17 times, and Maya stood at her reception desk watching this theater of anxiety unfold, watching people who'd spent years treating others as beneath them suddenly terrified of being judged themselves. Sophia grabbed Maya's arm at 11:50, her voice urgent and low. "Did you hear? The owner is apparently some young tech billionaire. Made his fortune in his 20s and bought this place as an investment. No one knows what he looks like because he's never done press, never appeared at industry events. It's like he's a ghost." And Maya, David said if the owner doesn't like what he sees today, if he decides we're not profitable enough, he could fire everyone and start over. We could all lose our jobs. The clock struck noon, and the lobby fell silent, every staff member frozen in position, every eye fixed on the massive revolving doors at the entrance. And Maya felt time slow down the way it does in dreams, felt each second stretch and distort. And then she saw it, a black Rolls-Royce pulling up to the entrance, the kind of vehicle that costs more than most people's houses. Its windows tinted so dark they looked like portals to another dimension. The valet opened the door with trembling hands, and Maya watched David Deckard step forward, his practiced smile plastered across his face. Watched Patricia and the other managers arrange themselves in their receiving line. Watched the entire staff of the Emerald Grand Hotel hold their collective breath as a figure emerged from the vehicle. And the world tilted on its axis. Reality cracked open like an egg, because the man stepping out of that $300,000 car, the man wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maya earned in 6 months, the man who moved with quiet confidence as cameras flashed and staff gasped, was Ethan Corleone, her husband, the janitor everyone had mocked, the man whose hands she'd held while people called him worthless. And Maya felt her knees go weak as their eyes met across the lobby, felt everything she thought she knew about her life shatter into a million glittering pieces. And in that moment, she realized she hadn't married a janitor at all. She'd married the man who owned everything, everyone, the entire empire. and the look on David Deckard's face as recognition hit him. As he realized the janitor he'd humiliated for months was actually his boss, was worth every second of confusion currently exploding through Maya's mind. The silence in the Emerald Grand's lobby lasted exactly 3 seconds before David Deckard's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. And Maya watched from her reception desk as the general manager, who'd spent months humiliating her husband, now stood frozen in his expensive suit. Realizing he'd been torturing his own boss, that every cruel order, every demeaning task, every mocking comment had been witnessed and catalogued by the one person who could destroy his career with a single word. Ethan moved through the lobby with the same quiet grace Maya had always noticed. But now it read differently. Now she could see it wasn't the patience of someone beaten down by circumstances, but the confidence of a man who'd always held all the power and had simply chosen not to use it. He walked past the receiving line of terrified managers without acknowledging them. His eyes locked on Maya, and when he reached her desk, he said softly, "Hello, wife. Surprised to see me." And there was something in his voice, a mixture of apology and challenge that made her heart race, even as her mind struggled to process the impossible reality standing before her. Patricia Monroe recovered first, her survival instincts kicking in as she stepped forward with a smile so forced it looked painful. "Mr. Corleone, what an honor. We had no idea, if we'd known you were, that you were." But Ethan raised one hand, and she fell silent immediately. The gesture so casual, yet so commanding, that Maya felt a shiver run down her spine. This was a man who'd built empires, who commanded boardrooms, who'd made billions before 30, and she'd been bringing him coffee during his cleaning shifts, like he was someone who needed her charity. "I'd like a private tour of the facility," Ethan announced, his voice carrying across the silent lobby. "Maya will accompany me. The rest of you will return to your duties and await further instructions." And the way he said her name, with such casual intimacy in front of everyone who'd mocked their marriage, sent a clear message that reverberated through the staff like an earthquake. The janitor's wife was actually the owner's wife, which meant she'd just become the most powerful person in the building after her husband. Maya's hands trembled as she stepped out from behind the reception desk, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Why had he hidden this? Why had he endured months of humiliation? Why had he let her believe he was struggling when he could have given her anything? And as they walked toward the elevators, she felt the weight of every staff member's stare, felt Sophia's shock and Patricia's fear and David's absolute terror. And she realized her entire world had just inverted. Everyone who'd pitied her now envied her. Everyone who'd mocked her now feared her. And she didn't know how to feel about any of it. The elevator doors closed, and they were alone, 40 floors of vertical space stretching above them. And Maya turned to face the stranger wearing her husband's face. "Why?" was all she could manage. One word containing every question burning through her chest. And Ethan's expression softened, the billionaire mask slipping to reveal the man she'd fallen in love with underneath. "I needed to know if someone could love me for who I am, not what I have. I've had people worship my bank account my entire adult life. Maya, I've had women throw themselves at me because of the zeros in my net worth. I've had friends betray me for a fraction of my wealth. And I was so tired of never knowing if anyone saw me, really saw me. So I came here in disguise, took the lowest position in my own hotel, and I waited to see if anyone would look past the uniform." The elevator climbed, and Maya felt anger rising with it, hot and sharp. Because yes, she understood his reasoning, but he'd let her suffer, let her endure mockery and pity. Let her mother cry on the phone about her ruined future. Let her friends abandon her, all while he could have ended it with a single revelation. You let them humiliate us, she said, her voice shaking. You let Patricia lecture me about associating with low-level staff. You let David treat you like garbage. You let everyone think I'd thrown my life away, and you just stood there cleaning floors while I defended a lie. Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away, the elevator reaching the 40th floor, the executive level that regular staff never accessed. And when the doors opened, Maya saw an office that looked like it belonged in a magazine, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than cars, and on the desk a photograph that made her breath catch. It was her, a candid shot from 2 months ago. Her laughing at something Ethan had said during one of their courtyard lunches, and she realized he'd had this printed and framed, had kept it in his private office, had looked at it during whatever mysterious business he conducted up here, while she thought he was scrubbing toilets. I fell in love with you, Maya, Ethan said quietly, standing in the doorway of his hidden empire. Real love, the kind that doesn't come with conditions or calculations. You brought me coffee, not because you wanted something, but because you're kind. You married me knowing I had nothing, because you loved who I was. And yes, I let you endure judgment, and I'm sorry for that. But I needed to be certain. I needed to know that when the truth came out, when you discovered everything, you wouldn't stay with me just because of this. He gestured at the office, at the view, at the visible evidence of wealth beyond measure. I needed to know you'd stay because of us. Maya stood in that office feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Behind her was a simple life she'd thought she was building. Ahead was a future she couldn't even begin to imagine. And somewhere in between was the question that mattered most. Could she forgive him for the deception? Could she trust him again? And did the love they'd built on a foundation of lies have any chance of surviving the weight of truth? Maya spent the next 3 hours watching Ethan conduct his inspection, with a precision that made her realize she'd never actually known him at all. He moved through the hotel, identifying problems she hadn't even noticed, pointing out inefficiencies in housekeeping schedules, questioning budget allocations that David stammered to explain, reviewing employee files with a photographic memory that revealed he'd been paying attention to everything during his months undercover, and the staff who'd once ignored him now hung on his every word like their lives depended on it, which in a very real sense they did. David Deckard followed 3 steps behind, like a condemned man walking to his execution. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. And when they reached the service hallway where he'd once forced Ethan to scrub floors on his hands and knees, Ethan stopped and turned to face the general manager with an expression that could have frozen fire. Tell me, David, what's your management philosophy? How do you believe employees should be treated? And David's mouth opened, but no sound came out, because they both knew the answer. They both remembered every humiliation, every cruel order, every moment of unnecessary degradation. Maya watched this confrontation from 2 feet away, feeling like she was watching a stranger. This wasn't the gentle man who'd held her hand during walks. This was a billionaire who'd built empires and clearly knew how to wield power like a surgical instrument. And she found herself wondering which version was real, or if maybe both were real, and she'd only been allowed to see the half he wanted her to see. The thought made her feel sick, because if he could hide something this massive, what else might he be concealing? Patricia Monroe appeared around the corner at exactly the wrong moment, her arms full of linens. And when she saw Ethan standing there in his expensive suit, she dropped everything, sheets scattering across the floor like snow, and Maya watched the head of housekeeping's face cycle through shock and fear and desperate calculation, before landing on a smile so obsequious it was almost painful to witness. Mr. Corleone, I just want to say, I always knew there was something special about you. I told Maya from the beginning that you were different, that you had potential. I always supported your relationship. And the lie was so blatant, so completely opposite to the reality of her months of warnings and lectures that Maya actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that echoed in the hallway. Ethan's expression didn't change as he looked at Patricia, his voice calm and cold. You told my wife she was throwing her life away by marrying me. You said I was a parasite, latching onto her paycheck. You warned her that men like me see pretty faces and steady incomes and take advantage. I heard every word. Patricia, I was standing around that corner with my mop bucket while you delivered your concerned advice. So please don't insult both our intelligences by pretending you supported us. And Patricia's face went white, her mouth opening and closing, and Maya felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. Watching this woman who'd made her life difficult now facing consequences. Because Ying, Patricia had been cruel, but there was something unsettling about the absolute power Ethan wielded. The way he could destroy careers with a sentence. The inspection continued through the afternoon, Ethan making notes on a tablet that probably cost more than Maya's monthly salary. And everywhere they went, staff members scrambled to look busy, to appear competent, to somehow undo months of behavior that had been witnessed and recorded by the man they dismissed as irrelevant. And Maya realized with growing unease that her husband had essentially been conducting a months-long undercover investigation of his own property, that every conversation she'd thought was private had been part of some larger strategy she hadn't been informed about, that their entire relationship might have started as a social experiment to test whether anyone could love him without his money. They ended up back in his 40th floor office as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked fake, too beautiful to be real. And Maya stood at the window feeling like she was floating, untethered from everything she'd thought was solid ground. I need you to understand something, Ethan said from behind her, his voice softer now, more like the man she'd married. I didn't plan to fall in love with you. I came here to prove a point to myself, to confirm what I already believed about human nature, that everyone has a price, that genuine connection is impossible when you have what I have. But you surprised me, Maya. You kept surprising me. And somewhere between the coffee you brought me and the way you defended me to your friends, I stopped conducting an experiment and started living a life I didn't know I wanted. Maya turned to face him, this man who was somehow both her husband and a stranger. You used me, she said quietly. You used everyone here. You let us all perform for you like we were in some kind of reality show you were producing. And yes, maybe I loved you for the right reasons, but Ethan, you didn't give me a choice. You didn't let me decide if I wanted to be part of your test. You just manipulated everything and everyone. And now you're standing here expecting me to be grateful that I passed your evaluation. And she watched something flicker across his face. Maybe guilt, maybe recognition, maybe just a realization that having all the money in the world doesn't mean you get to control how people react to your choices. The city lights began to sparkle below them as darkness fell, and Maya realized they were standing at a crossroads. She could walk away from this marriage, from this man who'd built their relationship on deception, no matter how pure his eventual feelings became, or she could try to find a way forward, try to build something real from the wreckage of his experiment. But either way, she needed him to understand that love without honesty isn't really love at all. It's just another transaction dressed up in prettier clothes, and she'd spent too many months defending their relationship to everyone who doubted it, to accept anything less than complete truth moving forward. Maya didn't go home that night, couldn't face the apartment she'd shared with Ethan, knowing that every moment they'd spent there had been shadowed by his deception. Instead, she checked into a modest hotel 3 blocks away, using her own credit card because she refused to touch anything connected to his wealth. And she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how you're supposed to process the discovery that your entire marriage was built on a lie, even if the love eventually became real. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Ethan, each one more desperate than the last. Please come home. We need to talk. I love you, Maya. That was never fake. But she couldn't bring herself to respond because what was she supposed to say? That she forgave him for treating their relationship like a social experiment? That she understood why he'd let her suffer through months of judgment and mockery while he played dress up in his own hotel? That money and power excuse manipulation as long as the manipulator eventually developed genuine feelings. Sophia showed up at her hotel room at midnight, somehow having tracked her down. And when Maya opened the door, her friend's face was a mixture of shock and something that looked uncomfortably like envy. Maya, do you understand what you have? Do you realize you're married to Ethan Corleone? The Ethan Corleone. He's worth billions. Actual billions. You could have anything you want, go anywhere, do anything, and you're hiding in a budget hotel because you're angry he didn't tell you he was rich. Do you know how insane that sounds? Maya felt something crack inside her chest. He didn't just not tell me, Sophia. He actively deceived me. He let everyone think he was a janitor. He watched people humiliate both of us. He turned our relationship into some kind of test to see if I was worthy of his trust. And yes, maybe I passed his evaluation, but I never agreed to be evaluated. I never consented to being part of his experiment. And the fact that you think I should be grateful just because he has money proves exactly why he felt the need to hide in the first place, because everyone sees the billions before they see the person. Sophia left 20 minutes later, their friendship feeling strained in ways Maya wasn't sure could be repaired, and she realized that Ethan's revelation hadn't just changed her relationship with him. It had changed every relationship she had, because now people would always wonder if she'd known, if she'd been in on it, if her love story was real or just another calculated move by a woman who'd secured a billionaire. The next morning, Maya returned to the Emerald Grand to collect her personal items from her locker, planning to quit because how could she continue working at a hotel her husband owned? How could she face the staff who now knew she'd been married to their boss while pretending to be one of them? But when she walked through the employee entrance, she found David Deckard's office being cleared out, his belongings in boxes, and Patricia Monroe standing in the hallway crying because she'd just been demoted to regular housekeeping staff, and Maya realized Ethan was systematically destroying everyone who'd made their lives difficult, wielding his power like a weapon, and it made her feel sick, because yes, these people had been cruel, but this felt like revenge, like punishment, like the actions of someone who'd been keeping score all along. She found Ethan in his office, still wearing yesterday's suit, looking like he hadn't slept. And when he saw her, his face transformed with hope. That died when he registered her expression. "You're firing people," Maya said, her voice flat. "David, Patricia, I heard you're reviewing the entire management structure. You're using your power to punish everyone who didn't treat the janitor with respect. And I need you to understand how that makes me feel. Like I married someone who's been playing a long game of revenge. Like our whole relationship was just the opening move in some elaborate plan to humiliate people who didn't know they were being tested." Ethan stood up, moving toward her. They created a toxic work environment, Maya. David was embezzling funds. Patricia was taking kickbacks from suppliers. I have documentation of actual crimes. This isn't revenge, it's accountability. And yes, maybe I'm enjoying it more than I should. But these people made your life hell. They made you cry. They made you doubt yourself. And I'm supposed to just let that go, because revealing my identity makes the consequences look personal. Maya felt tears burning in her eyes. "You're not supposed to let it go. You're supposed to have told me the truth from the beginning. You're supposed to have trusted me enough to let me make an informed choice about whether I wanted to be with you. But instead, you set up this elaborate scenario where I had no agency, no real choice, because I fell in love with a person who didn't exist. The real you is this. She gestured at the office, at the evidence of wealth and power. The real you fires people and owns hotels and apparently investigates crimes. And maybe I could have loved that person too, but I'll never know because you didn't give me the chance to meet him honestly. The silence that followed felt like the death of something precious, and Maya watched Ethan's face cycle through emotions she couldn't name. And she realized that for all his billions, for all his power and planning and careful manipulation, he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that love built on deception could survive the weight of truth, that she would choose the fairy tale ending over her own self respect. But Maya had spent too many years watching her mother stay with her father despite his lies, had promised herself she'd never accept less than complete honesty from a partner, and standing in that office overlooking a city that suddenly felt foreign. She understood that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the foundation matters more than the feelings built on top of it. And no amount of money or power or belated sincerity could change the fact that Ethan Corleone had stolen her choice. And she didn't know if she could ever forgive him for that. Maya walked out of Ethan's office and didn't look back, rode the elevator down 40 floors, feeling like she was descending from a fantasy into reality. And when she reached the lobby, she found the entire staff watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to fear to something that looked like calculation, and she realized that staying at the Emerald Grand was impossible now. Not because she was ashamed, but because every interaction would be filtered through the knowledge of who her husband was. Every conversation would carry the weight of power dynamics she'd never wanted to be part of. She submitted her resignation to human resources within the hour, effective immediately, and the HR director, a nervous woman named Carol, who'd always been kind, processed the paperwork with shaking hands, clearly terrified that rejecting the owner's wife's resignation might be a test, but accepting it might be equally dangerous. And Maya felt a wave of exhaustion at the realization that her mere existence now created anxiety for people who'd once been colleagues. That Ethan's deception had transformed her from a person into a symbol of power she'd never asked to represent. Ethan called 47 times that day. Maya counted each buzz of her phone like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall, and finally at 9 p.m. she answered, her voice hollow. "Stop calling." But he said, "I can't. I won't. Maya, please just listen. I know I handled this wrong. I know I should have told you sooner, but I'm asking you to consider what we have, what we built together. Yes, it started with deception, but it became real. The love is real, and I'm begging you to give me a chance to prove that the man you fell in love with is who I actually am. The money and the power are just circumstances. They're not me." Maya sat on the edge of her budget hotel bed, phone pressed to her ear, and said the thing she'd been thinking all day. The man I fell in love with brought me wildflowers he picked on his walk to work. He packed simple lunches we'd eat in the courtyard. He talked about saving up for a better apartment someday. He was humble and kind and present. But Ethan, that man doesn't exist. He was a character you played, and the real you is someone who fires people and owns empires and apparently thinks it's acceptable to manipulate someone's entire reality to test their character. So no, I don't think the man I loved is who you actually are. I think he was a role you performed. And the fact that you eventually developed genuine feelings doesn't change the fact that I fell in love with a fiction. The silence on the other end lasted so long Maya thought he'd hung up. But then she heard him breathing, heard what might have been crying, and he said in a voice that sounded broken, "You're right. You're completely right. And I don't know how to fix this." I don't know how to prove to you that the gentle parts were real too, that I wasn't performing kindness. I was finally allowing myself to be kind because I felt safe with you. Because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about ulterior motives or hidden agendas. But I understand if that's not enough. I understand if the foundation is too damaged to build on. Just please, before you make a final decision, let me show you something. One thing. And if after that you still want to walk away, I'll sign whatever papers you want. I'll make sure you're taken care of financially, even though I know you'll hate that. I'll let you go. Maya wanted to say no, wanted to hang up and block his number and start the process of divorce and rebuilding her life. But something in his voice, some quality of genuine desperation, made her pause. One thing, she said, you get one chance to show me whatever this is. And then I'm done. I'm making my decision, and you're going to respect it. No more manipulation. No more tests. No more games. They met the next morning at an address Ethan texted her, a building in a neighborhood Maya didn't recognize, modest and unremarkable. And when she arrived, she found Ethan standing outside, looking more like the janitor she'd married than the billionaire she'd discovered. Jeans and a simple shirt. No suit, no power. Just a man who looked terrified. And he led her inside without speaking, up 3 flights of stairs to an apartment that took her breath away. Not because it was luxurious, but because it was full of her. Photographs covered every wall. Not expensive professional shots, but candid moments. Maya laughing at the coffee machine, Maya reading in the courtyard, Maya dancing in their kitchen when she thought no one was watching. And in the center of the room was an easel holding a half-finished painting. Ethan's work, she realized. A portrait of her face rendered in oils with a skill that spoke of years of practice. And she understood suddenly that this apartment wasn't new, that he'd been coming here throughout their marriage, that this was where he'd been processing his double life, trying to reconcile the person he was with, the person he was pretending to be. I started painting again because of you, Ethan said quietly, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to enter his own space. I hadn't touched a brush in 10 years. Gave it up when I started building the business because there wasn't time for anything that didn't generate revenue. But after I met you, I needed somewhere to put all the feelings. Needed a way to process what was happening to me. And I'd come here after my shifts, and I'd paint you, paint us. Paint the life I was terrified I'd lose when you discovered the truth. And I know this doesn't fix the deception. I know art doesn't erase lies. But Maya, I need you to understand that every moment with you was real for me. The janitor wasn't a disguise. He was me finally allowing myself to be vulnerable, to be soft, to be someone other than Ethan Corleone the billionaire. And yes, I should have told you sooner, yes. I stole your choice, and that was wrong. But I'm giving you a choice now. You can walk away, and I'll let you go. Or you can stay, and we can try to build something honest from here. No more secrets, no more tests. Just two people who love each other, trying to figure out if that's enough. Maya stood in that apartment, surrounded by evidence of obsession or devotion. She couldn't tell which. And she realized that Ethan had been as trapped by his wealth as she'd been freed by her lack of it. That his deception had been born not from cruelty, but from a loneliness so profound he'd been willing to risk everything to escape it. And while that didn't excuse what he'd done, it helped her understand why he'd done it. And understanding felt like the first step towards something, though she didn't know if that something was forgiveness or just closure. Maya spent 3 days in that apartment, not living there exactly, but visiting, sitting among the paintings and photographs, trying to understand the man who'd created this shrine to a relationship he'd been terrified of losing. And Ethan came each day bringing coffee and pastries from the small bakery near their old apartment. Not the expensive kind a billionaire could afford, but the simple ones they'd shared when he was pretending to be poor. And they talked in ways they never had before. Honest conversations about his childhood wealth and the isolation it created, about her fear of becoming her mother, who'd stayed with a liar, about whether love built on deception could be rebuilt on truth, or if some foundations were too cracked to support anything lasting. On the fourth day, Maya made her decision, not because she'd forgiven him completely, but because she'd realized that perfection wasn't the goal, that every relationship was built on a series of choices to stay or go, to forgive or hold grudges, to see the person in front of you or the idealized version you'd imagined. And while Ethan had stolen her initial choice, he was offering her a real one now. The choice to build something new, with full knowledge of who he actually was. Billions and paintings and loneliness and love, all mixed together in a complicated human being who'd made terrible decisions for understandable reasons. I have conditions, Maya said, sitting across from Ethan in his art studio apartment, watching sunlight paint patterns on the wooden floor. First, you sell the Emerald Grand. I can't be married to someone who owns the place where we met, where you conducted your experiment. It will always feel tainted, and I need a clean slate. Second, you set up a fund for the employees who lost their jobs, not as charity, but as acknowledgement that your deception had collateral damage, and those people deserve compensation even if they were cruel. Third, you go to therapy. Actual therapy with a professional who can help you understand why you thought manipulation was an acceptable way to find love. And fourth, we start over, completely over. You court me like we just met. You let me see the real you, the billionaire, and the artist, and whoever else you've been hiding. And I'll decide day by day whether I want to stay. No promises, no guarantees, just honest attempts at connection. Ethan's face cycled through surprise and relief, and something that looked like hope. I'll do all of it. Every condition, Maya. I'll sell the hotel tomorrow. I'll write the checks. I'll find the best therapist in the city, and I'll court you. Like my life depends on it, because it does. You're the only thing that's ever made me feel like a complete person. Not the money, or the power, or the success, but you. Just you. Seeing me, and choosing to stay even after knowing the worst. They sold the Emerald Grand 3 months later to a hotel conglomerate that promised to retain all staff, and Maya insisted on being present when Ethan signed the papers, watching him let go of the place where their story began, and she felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the anger she'd been carrying. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding that people were complicated, and love was messy, and sometimes the best you could hope for was two imperfect people trying their best to be honest. Ethan's therapy sessions became a regular part of their routine, and he'd come home each week looking exhausted, but lighter. And he'd tell Maya things he was learning about himself, about how growing up wealthy had taught him to view relationships as transactions, about his fear that without money he was fundamentally unlovable, about the ways his deception had been less about testing her and more about testing whether he could be loved for himself. And Maya listened and shared her own fears, her worry that she'd only fallen for him because he'd seemed safe and humble, her concern that the real Ethan might be too powerful and complicated for her to love. And slowly, conversation by conversation, they built something that felt more solid than what they'd had before. 6 months after the revelation, Maya moved into Ethan's penthouse, not because she needed his money, but because she decided she wanted to try building a life with him, the real him, and she insisted on paying rent, even though he owned the building, insisted on maintaining her independence, even as she chose interdependence. And Ethan accepted her terms with a grace that showed he was learning, that therapy was working, that he was becoming someone who understood that love wasn't about control or tests, but about mutual respect and chosen vulnerability. Maya started her own business 9 months into their reconciliation, a consulting firm helping hotels improve employee relations and workplace culture. And Ethan offered to fund it, but Maya refused, taking out a small business loan instead, because she needed to know she could build something that was entirely hers. And Ethan respected that decision, even though she could see it hurt him to watch her struggle financially when he could solve her problems with a single check. But his restraint showed her he was changing, that he was learning to let her make her own choices, even when those choices were harder than they needed to be. Her first major client was the new owners of the Emerald Grand, who'd heard about her unique perspective and wanted her expertise. And walking through those familiar hallways as a consultant rather than a concierge felt like reclaiming a part of herself she'd thought was lost. And when she presented her recommendations to management, suggesting better wages and respect protocols and employee recognition programs, she saw several former colleagues in the audience, including Patricia Monroe, who watched with an expression that might have been grudging respect. And afterward, Patricia approached her in the hallway and said simply, "You did good, Maya. You landed on your feet." And Maya nodded, understanding that this was as close to an apology as she'd ever get. And somehow that was enough. A year after the revelation, on what would have been their second anniversary if they were counting from the original wedding, Ethan surprised Maya by taking her to a small art gallery in Brooklyn, a modest space nothing like the prestigious Manhattan galleries where billionaires usually showed their work. And when they walked inside, Maya gasped, because every painting on the walls was Ethan's. Dozens of canvases showing their journey, the early days of their courtship, the joy of their first wedding, the pain of the revelation, the slow rebuilding of trust. And in the center of the gallery was a new painting she'd never seen, a portrait of Maya, standing at a crossroads, one path leading to darkness and one to light. And beneath it was a small plaque that read, "The woman who taught me that love is a choice we make every day." And Maya turned to Ethan with tears streaming down her face and saw that he was crying too. And she understood that this exhibition wasn't just art. It was his public acknowledgement of everything they'd been through. His way of showing the world that he wasn't ashamed of their complicated story, but proud of how they'd fought to save it. 2 years after the revelation, Maya stood in the nursery of their penthouse apartment, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other holding a paintbrush as she added final touches to the mural Ethan had started. A whimsical garden scene with hidden details only they would understand. A janitor's cart tucked behind a rose bush, a tiny emerald embedded in the painted sky. Small acknowledgments of where they'd come from and how far they'd traveled. And she heard Ethan's footsteps behind her and felt his arms wrap around her waist, his hands covering hers on their unborn daughter's future. And he whispered, "I still can't believe you're giving me this. A family, a real family, after everything I put you through." And Maya turned in his arms and said, "We're giving each other this, Ethan. That's what partnership means. We both chose this. We both fought for this. And our daughter is going to grow up knowing that love isn't about perfection. It's about two people who refuse to give up on each other even when giving up would be easier." Maya's consulting business had grown beyond her wildest dreams. Not because of Ethan's connections, though he'd offered them repeatedly, but because her unique perspective, her experience of being on both sides of the power dynamic, gave her insights that traditional consultants couldn't match. And she now employed 15 people, all of them former hospitality workers who'd faced discrimination or mistreatment. And together they were changing the industry one hotel at a time, teaching management that respecting employees wasn't just morally right, but financially smart, that happy workers created better guest experiences and better bottom lines. And every time Maya signed a new client, she thought about Patricia Monroe and all the others who'd mocked her. And she felt not vindication exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that she'd transformed her pain into purpose. Ethan had changed too, not just in therapy, though that continued to be part of his routine, but in fundamental ways that showed he'd internalized the lessons Maya had taught him. He'd stepped back from the day to day operations of his hotel empire, hiring a management team he trusted and focusing instead on his art. And his paintings had gained recognition not because of his wealth, but because of their raw emotional honesty, critics calling his work unflinchingly vulnerable and a meditation on privilege and love. And he donated half the proceeds from every sale to the employee fund Maya had insisted he create. The fund that had now helped dozens of hospitality workers start their own businesses, or go back to school, or simply survive during hard times. And watching him use his wealth to lift others up rather than test them showed Maya that people could change, that growth was possible, that the man she'd fallen in love with and the man he'd become could coexist in the same complicated human being. They got married again on their third anniversary, not because the first wedding wasn't legal, but because Maya wanted to make vows with full knowledge of who she was marrying. And this time the ceremony was different, held not in a courthouse, but in the Brooklyn Art Gallery where Ethan had first exhibited his paintings of their journey. And instead of just Sophia and a few friends, they invited everyone who'd been part of their story, the good and the bad, Patricia Monroe and the other former Emerald Grand employees, Ethan's therapy group, Maya's consulting team, even the HR director, Carol, who'd processed Maya's resignation with shaking hands. And when Maya walked down the makeshift aisle between paintings of their past, she felt not nervousness, but certainty. And when she reached Ethan and saw the love and gratitude and hard-won humility in his eyes, she knew that this was what happy endings actually looked like. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but earned. Not a fairy tale, but something better. A true story of two flawed people who'd chosen each other despite and because of their imperfections. In her vows, Maya said, "I'm not going to pretend the deception didn't hurt. I'm not going to say I've completely forgiven or completely forgotten, but I am going to say that I choose you, today and tomorrow, and all the days after. I choose the man who paints me in oils and goes to therapy and lets me pay my own rent. I choose the complicated billionaire who learned that love can't be tested or controlled. I choose us, messy and imperfect and real." And Ethan's vows were simpler, just, "You saved my life, Maya." Not by loving me, but by refusing to love me until I became someone worthy of that love. And I promised to spend every day trying to be that person. Not the janitor I pretended to be, and not the billionaire I was born to be, but the man you helped me become. The one who understands that the greatest privilege isn't wealth or power, but being chosen by someone who sees all of you and decides you're enough. 6 months later, Maya gave birth to their daughter Elena, named after Maya's grandmother, who taught her that self-respect was more valuable than any amount of money. And as Ethan held their baby girl for the first time, his tears streaming down his face, Maya watched him whisper promises to their daughter, promises to raise her with humility and honesty, to teach her that wealth was a responsibility, not a right, to show her through example that love required vulnerability and trust, and the courage to be truly seen. And Maya knew that their story, as complicated and painful as it had been, had led them exactly where they needed to be. Not to a perfect ending, but to a new beginning. And as she drifted off to sleep that first night with Elena between them, Ethan's hand holding hers across their daughter's tiny body, Maya thought about the young concierge who'd married a janitor despite everyone's mockery. And she wanted to tell that girl that she'd been right to follow her heart. That the journey would be harder than she'd imagined, but the destination would be worth every painful step. That sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones where people choose each other not once, but over and over again. in moments of doubt and pain and fear, choosing love not because it's easy, but because it's real. And real, Maya had learned, was the only thing worth having, the only thing that lasted, the only thing that mattered when everything else fell away. And as she felt Ethan's lips press against her forehead and heard him whisper, "Thank you for not giving up on us," Maya smiled and whispered back, "Thank you for becoming someone I didn't have to give up on." And in that moment, surrounded by love and honesty and hard won trust, she knew that their story, imperfect as it